When Edgar Cayce was asked what happens in the first moments after death, his answer shocked even those who thought they knew his work. He said there's a period, usually lasting approximately 3 days, though time becomes meaningless in that space, where the soul enters what he called the Great Silence. Not heaven, not reincarnation, not judgment or reward or any of the things religious traditions had promised. Silence, complete, profound, mysterious silence. And in over 14,000 readings spanning 4 decades, this was one of the topics Cayce returned to most frequently, but explained least directly. As if the silence itself resisted being put into words. As if language, which depends on movement and sound and contrast, simply couldn't hold the weight of what happens in that motionless space. But he tried. Again and again he tried to tell us. In the next 40 minutes, you're going to discover what Cayce actually revealed about this forgotten threshold between death and what comes after. Why does the soul need silence after leaving the body? What's happening during those 3 days that feels like eternity? And most importantly, why did Cayce say that understanding this silence is essential not just for the dying, but for the living who remain behind? This teaching changes everything about how we approach death, how we grieve, how we understand consciousness itself. Because what Cayce discovered is this: the silence between death and ashes isn't absence, it's presence, the deepest, most complete presence a soul will ever experience. And what happens there determines everything that follows. Before we go deeper, you need to understand how Edgar Cayce came to know this. His knowledge of death wasn't theoretical. It wasn't channeled from distant spirits or borrowed from ancient texts. It came from direct experience. In 1918, Cayce suffered a severe reaction to medication that caused what medical records at the time called suspended animation. For nearly 6 minutes, by the physician's account, his heart stopped beating. His breathing ceased. By every measurable standard, Edgar Cayce had died, but his consciousness hadn't stopped. During those minutes, he later described, his awareness traversed what he called the borderlands, the spaces between life and death, body and spirit, time and timelessness. He moved through territories most people only glimpse in near-death experience, but he moved through them slowly enough to map them, to remember them, to return with testimony that would shape everything he taught for the rest of his life. This is why Cayce's descriptions of the post-death silence carry particular weight. Unlike religious doctrine or philosophical speculation, his words came from remembered territory. He knew its geography. More importantly, he understood its purpose. Throughout the remaining decades of his life, whenever someone asked about death, whether fearing their own or grieving another's, Cayce would return to this teaching about the Great Silence. He called it the soul's sacred pause, and he insisted it was the most important transition point in the entire cycle of incarnation. Not the moment of death itself, not the journey toward light, not even the life review that so many traditions speak of, but the silence that follows all of it, the pause that allows everything else to integrate, to settle, to become what it was always meant to become. This wasn't just information he was offering, it was instruction given by someone who had stood in that silence and returned to tell us what waits there. And what he found was nothing like what religions or cultures had taught him to expect. So what exactly is this silence? Why does it exist? Cayce explained it through a metaphor so simple it almost sounds too ordinary. But listen carefully, because the simplicity is where the power lives. He said, imagine living your entire life in a room filled with deafening noise. The noise of the body's demands, hunger, pain, pleasure, exhaustion. The noise of the mind's commentary, judgment, comparison, memory, planning. The noise of the world's opinions, who you should be, what you should want, how you should live. The noise of the ego's fears, death, rejection, meaninglessness, being forgotten. From the moment you're born until the moment you die, you live inside this noise. Even in meditation, when you're trying to find quiet, you're still in a body trying to quiet a mind. The machinery is still running, however softly, and then suddenly, you step out of the room. For the first time in what might be dozens of lifetimes, you experience complete quiet. Not the quiet of meditation, where you're practicing stillness, the quiet of being without trying. This is the great silence. Cayce said the silence serves a specific function that cannot be bypassed. It's not rest, though it may feel restful to some souls. It's not waiting, though it may seem like waiting to those left behind. It's integration, the soul's necessary pause to absorb and metabolize everything it just experienced in physical form. He described it as similar to deep sleep, but with full awareness. You're not unconscious. You're not dreaming in the way you dreamed while alive. You're beyond consciousness and unconsciousness in a state that has no earthly equivalent. And during this pause, something crucial happens. The life you just lived begins to reveal its true meaning, stripped of all the stories you told yourself while living it. The defenses you built, the justifications you crafted, the identities you maintained, all of it dissolves in the silence, not violently, not through some external judgment, but naturally, the way salt dissolves in warm water. But here's what makes this teaching so mysterious and so important to understand. Cayce said not all souls experience the silence the same way. For some, it's brief, a matter of hours before they're ready to move forward. For others, it extends for what would feel like days, weeks, even longer if measured by Earth time. And what determines the difference? That's what we're about to discover. Let's slow down and walk through what Cayce described happens in the exact sequence after death. The moment the heart stops, he said, consciousness doesn't immediately leave the body. There's a brief period, seconds to minutes, where awareness is still present but no longer bound by physical sensation. You might see your body from outside it. You might see people gathered around, doctors working, loved ones weeping, strangers looking on. But you're not quite in the room anymore, even though you can perceive it. You're observing from a place that's neither inside the body nor fully outside it yet. Cayce called this the loosening, when the silver cord, that energetic tether between body and soul that mystics have described for centuries, begins to dissolve. This loosening isn't instant for everyone. Some souls linger here, confused or unwilling to fully release. They try to communicate with the living, frustrated that they can't be heard. They watch their loved ones grieve and want desperately to say, "I'm here, I'm okay, please don't cry." Others move through this phase quickly, drawn by a light or presence they recognize immediately. A grandmother who passed years before, a guide they've worked with across lifetimes. The pull is gentle but unmistakable, and they follow it without hesitation. But regardless of how fast or slow this loosening occurs, eventually every soul reaches the threshold. Cayce described it as stepping through an invisible membrane. One moment you're perceiving the physical world, still oriented toward the life you just left, still holding the shape of the person you were. The next moment, you're in the silence, and everything changes. Time stops meaning what it meant. You're no longer experiencing moments in sequence, this, then this, then this. You're simply in timelessness, where past and future collapse into a single eternal now. Identity softens. The sharp edges of I am this and I am not that begin to blur. You remember being the person who just died, but you also remember being other people, in other lives, in other bodies. All of it equally present, equally real, equally you. Memory remains but loses its emotional charge. You can recall events from the life you just left, but they don't hurt anymore. They don't carry the weight of regret or pride or grief. They simply are, like looking at photographs from a trip you took long ago. You're not thinking anymore, not in the way thinking happened while alive, where one thought triggers another in an endless chain. You're not feeling anymore, at least not in the old way where emotions overwhelmed or propelled you. You're simply present, purely, completely present. And according to Cayce, this is where the real journey begins. Here's where Cayce's teaching becomes unexpectedly profound and unusually specific. He said the primary function of the Great Silence is to allow what he called the automatic life review, but not the kind popularized by near-death experience literature. This isn't a replay of events. It isn't watching your life flash before your eyes like a movie while some divine authority takes notes. It's something far more intimate and far more transformative. Cayce explained that while in silence, the soul isn't watching its life like a spectator. It's feeling the energetic signature of everything it generated while alive. Every choice doesn't appear as a recalled scene, but as frequency. An act of kindness shows up not as memory, but as a tone, a vibration that the soul recognizes as harmonic with its true nature. It resonates. It feels like coming home to something you'd forgotten you knew. An act of harm appears as dissonance, a frequency that feels foreign to the soul's essence, not evil, just misaligned, like hearing a wrong note in a familiar song. There's no judge standing outside you declaring right or wrong, no cosmic courtroom, no weighing of sins against virtues on some celestial scale, just the soul encountering the truth of what it created, and the truth is self-evident. This is why Cayce called it automatic. It happens by itself, the natural result of consciousness becoming still enough to perceive its own reflection clearly. Think about water. When water is churning, agitated, filled with sediment, you can't see through it. You can't see what's at the bottom. You can't even see your own reflection on the surface. But when water becomes still, completely, utterly still, it becomes transparent. You can see all the way to the bottom. You can see exactly what's there. The Great Silence is that stillness. And in that stillness, your whole life becomes transparent. But here's what makes the silence so crucial, so irreplaceable. This review can only happen in complete quiet. While alive, we're too immersed in justification, too busy defending our choices, managing our self-image, maintaining the story we tell ourselves about who we are and why we did what we did. The noise of ego is so loud that true self-perception becomes impossible. The silence strips all that away, not cruelly, not through force, but simply by removing the conditions that allowed self-deception to operate. And in the stripping, something unexpected emerges, not shame, not judgment, but compassion, profound, overwhelming compassion for yourself and everyone involved in your life's story. In one documented case preserved in the ARE archives, Cayce described a soul who had lived a difficult life marked by addiction and broken relationships. When this soul entered the Great Silence and the review began, it expected condemnation, expected to be shown all its failures as proof of unworthiness. Instead, what emerged was understanding. The soul suddenly saw the wounds that had driven the addiction, the childhood trauma that had made connection feel dangerous, the generational patterns inherited from parents who had inherited them from their parents, the soul contracts made before birth, choosing difficult circumstances as accelerated paths to specific wisdom, and the soul wept, not from shame but from recognition. This is what I came to learn. This is what I chose to experience, and I did it. I survived it. I learned from it. Cayce said this moment of recognition, when the soul finally understands its own story without defense or denial, is the beginning of healing that may have taken multiple lifetimes to arrive at. The silence doesn't judge you. It reveals you. And in that revelation, you become free. But what happens next depends entirely on how you respond to what you see. Not every soul receives the silence in the same way. Cayce identified 3 distinct response patterns based on the soul's level of spiritual development and its relationship to truth during the life just completed. Understanding these patterns isn't just academic, it's deeply practical because how you live now directly shapes which response will be yours. The first response, the souls who rest. These are beings who lived with relative integrity, who faced their shadows while alive, who did the inner work of honest self-examination, who died with minimal unfinished business. They didn't live perfect lives. Cayce was clear that perfection isn't the point, but they lived aware lives. For them, the great silence is profoundly restful, a deep, restorative pause before choosing what comes next. They sink into it the way you'd sink into warm water after days of walking through desert heat. Cayce said these souls often remain in the silence for the full 3-day period, absorbing its gift completely, not because they have to, but because they can. They are not afraid of what the silence will show them because they've already seen it. They looked while alive. The second response, the souls who resist. These are beings who died still heavily identified with ego, with unfinished attachments, with stories they're not ready to release. They arrive at the silence still clutching the identity they built. Successful businessman, devoted mother, wounded victim, spiritual seeker, whatever role gave them meaning and now feels threatened by dissolution. For them, the silence is disorienting, even frightening. They struggle against it, trying to maintain the boundaries of self, even as those boundaries naturally begin to soften. In one reading, Cayce described a man who had spent his entire life building an empire, defining himself through achievement and control. When he died and entered the silence, he fought it, kept trying to do something, to manage the experience, to maintain the identity of powerful man who makes things happen. But the silence can't be managed. It can only be received. Cayce said these souls often exit the silence prematurely. They move toward reincarnation quickly, sometimes within weeks or months of Earth time, because the stillness is too confronting. They'd rather return to the noise of physical life than face what the silence wants to show them. This isn't failure, it's simply where they are in their evolution. The silence will be there waiting for them next time and the time after that, for as many lifetimes as it takes. The third response, the souls who dissolve. These are highly evolved beings for whom the silence isn't an end point, but a doorway into even deeper states of consciousness. They don't just rest in the silence, they expand through it. They use it as a launching point into dimensions that most souls won't access for many lifetimes. Realms of pure creativity, of teaching, of service to the unfolding universe itself. Cayce said these souls might remain in the silent state for what would equate to weeks, months, even years, if measured in Earth time, though for them it's experienced as a single eternal moment that contains all moments. When they finally emerge, they often choose not to reincarnate immediately. Instead, they become guides, teachers, the wise presences that other souls encounter at their own moment of death. Here's the key insight that runs through all 3 responses. Your relationship to the great silence reflects your relationship to truth. If you've practiced facing truth while alive, seeing yourself clearly, accepting what is rather than clinging to what you wish were true, the silence becomes gift. If you've spent your life avoiding, defending, maintaining false stories about yourself and your life, the silence becomes confrontation. Either way, it offers exactly what you need. The universe is precise that way. Now we shift from understanding what happens in the silence to something immediately practical, something that matters if you've ever lost someone, or if you know you will. Cayce said the 3-day silence period is not a time of separation, but of profound connection, if the living understand how to honor it. This chapter is going to give you specific guidance for what to do during those crucial days after someone dies. And understanding this might be one of the most compassionate gifts you can offer someone you love, either now or in the future. First, create physical stillness around the body. Cayce said the soul can still perceive disturbances in the physical space it just left, not in the way it perceived while alive, but there's still a connection, a sensitivity, during that initial loosening we talked about. Loud grief expressed right next to the body, chaotic activity, invasive medical procedures, bright lights, and harsh sounds. All of these create what Cayce called energetic static that makes it harder for the soul to settle into the silence. He recommended, whenever possible, keeping the body in a peaceful environment for at least 3 days before cremation or burial. Dim light, quiet, presence that's calm rather than frantic. This isn't always possible in modern medical systems, and Cayce understood that. But when it is possible, when someone dies at home, or when the family has choice about timing, honoring those 3 days can make a profound difference. Second, speak to them in silence. This is going to sound strange, but Cayce was explicit about it. The newly deceased can perceive thoughts directed toward them far more clearly than they could perceive spoken words while alive. Mental communication, prayer, loving thoughts, conscious release reaches them directly in the silence, not as words, but as feeling tones, as energetic messages that they understand immediately. But here's what's crucial. Don't project grief onto them. Don't bind them with, "Please don't leave me," or "I can't live without you," or "How could you abandon us?" Those messages, born from your own pain, create cords of attachment that can make it harder for them to complete their journey. Not impossible. Nothing you do can trap them permanently, but harder. Instead, offer permission. I release you to your journey. I honor what you must do. I trust that you're exactly where you need to be. I will be okay. I will find my way. You can go in peace. One woman wrote to Cayce months after her husband died, describing how she'd spent the first 2 weeks after his death, begging him to stay close, to give her signs, to somehow make his presence known because she couldn't bear the loss. Cayce's reading was gentle but clear. Her husband was caught, torn between his love for her and his need to continue his soul's journey. He was standing at the edge of the silence but couldn't fully enter because he felt her desperate need for him. When she finally understood, she changed her practice. She sat in meditation every evening and consciously released him. I love you, I miss you, and I set you free. Complete your journey. I'll be here when you return. Within days, she had a dream where he appeared, radiant and whole, thanking her for letting him go. And for the first time since his death, she felt peace instead of panic. This is love that transcends death. Not the clinging kind, the liberating kind. Third, trust the silence. The hardest instruction, but perhaps the most important. Our impulse when someone dies is to fill the void. With ritual, with activity, with memorial services and gatherings and constant talking about the person. All of that has value, certainly. But Cayce said it shouldn't happen immediately. The silence requires space. It requires us to do nothing, which feels almost unbearable in grief. Honor their 3 days. Give them that gift. Let them have their sacred pause before you rush into ceremony and closure. There will be time for all of that. There will be time to celebrate their life, to gather community, to process your loss publicly. But first, give them silence. And in giving them silence, practice your own. Sit with the mystery. Sit with not knowing. Sit with the emptiness that feels like it might swallow you. Because that practice, that willingness to be with silence even when it terrifies you, is preparing you for the silence you'll one day enter yourself. After the life review completes, after the soul has absorbed the full meaning of what it just experienced, after it has felt the truth of its choices without defense, Cayce said something extraordinary happens. A choice point emerges, not imposed from outside, not dictated by karma or divine decree, but arising from within the soul itself, from its own wisdom, from its own understanding of what it needs next. And understanding this choice is crucial because it reveals something fundamental about the nature of existence itself. Cayce explained that while in the great silence, every soul must decide, consciously or unconsciously, what it wants to do with what it has just learned. 3 primary pathways open. Path 1, immediate return. The soul recognizes unfinished lessons or unfulfilled soul contracts and chooses to reincarnate quickly, sometimes within months, sometimes even weeks of Earth time. Cayce said these are often souls who died suddenly or young, who feel a strong pull back to the physical plane to complete something specific. A promise made to a loved one, a gift meant to be shared, a pattern they were this close to breaking through and don't want to wait lifetimes to try again. In one documented reading, a young mother who had died in an accident found herself in the silence, understanding that her children still needed something she'd been meant to teach them. Not care, they would have care, but a specific quality of courage she'd been modeling right before she died. From the silence, she chose to return quickly, reincarnating within the same family just 2 years later as her own granddaughter. Cayce said this happens more often than people realize, souls circling back to complete what they'd begun. Path 2, extended rest and learning. The soul chooses to remain in non-physical dimensions for what might be years or decades or even centuries of Earth time, studying, healing, preparing for a more conscious next incarnation. Cayce said this is the most common choice for souls who lived long lives and completed major karmic cycles. They're not avoiding return, they're integrating deeply before choosing their next adventure. During this period, souls often work in what Cayce called the learning halls or preparation temples, non-physical spaces where they study with guides, review the Akashic Records, plan future incarnations with precision and care. It's not punishment to wait, it's wisdom, understanding that rushing back would mean repeating patterns without the awareness to transcend them. Path 3, service from the other side. The soul chooses to forego reincarnation entirely for a time and instead serve as a guide, teacher, or helper for those still in physical form or those transitioning through death. Cayce said these souls often become what he called threshold companions, the presences that newly deceased souls encounter as they cross over. The wise ones, the steady ones, the ones who have walked this path so many times that they can hold space for others walking it now. Some stay in this service role for what would be centuries, others for just a few generations, helping specific soul groups with whom they have ancient connections. Here's what's profound about this. Cayce insisted this choice is made in complete freedom. There's no coercion, no karmic demand forcing anyone into any particular path, no cosmic authority saying you must do this now. The universe doesn't force anyone back into incarnation, doesn't punish anyone for choosing rest, doesn't elevate anyone for choosing service. Whatever choice the soul makes in the silence arises from its own wisdom, its own understanding of what it needs next. And that choice, made in the deepest stillness you'll ever know, is always the right one, even when it looks from the outside like a mistake, Even when loved ones left behind don't understand why someone reincarnated so quickly or why they haven't returned to offer signs and comfort. Trust that the soul knows. Trust the choice made in silence. Not every soul gets to complete the great silence undisturbed. Cayce spoke with genuine sadness about circumstances that interrupt or shortcut this crucial integration period, and he was specific about the consequences of those interruptions, not to create fear, but to help the living make more conscious choices about how we handle death. The first disruption, violent or traumatic death. Cayce said souls who die violently, in accidents, through murder, in war, by suicide, often struggle to enter the silence fully. The shock to the system creates a kind of energetic static, like white noise, that drowns out the possibility of stillness. These souls may spend time in confused states, replaying the death moment over and over, unable to move beyond it. Not because they're trapped by some external force, but because the trauma is so overwhelming that the consciousness can't yet release it. Eventually, with help from guides, they do find their way to the silence, but the journey there might take much longer than the traditional 3 days. The second disruption, overwhelming grief from the living. When those left behind cannot release their grip through extreme grief, guilt, or spiritual dependency, the soul can feel torn between entering the silence and staying accessible to comfort the living. Cayce described this as one of the most painful experiences for a newly deceased soul. They can feel your anguish. They want desperately to ease it. But staying present to comfort you means delaying their own healing, their own integration, their own journey forward. This is why the practice we discussed earlier matters so much. When you consciously release them, when you tell them it's okay to go, you're giving them permission to complete what they need to complete. Your grief is valid. Your pain is real. But projecting it onto them creates a burden they were never meant to carry. The third disruption, premature cremation or organ harvesting. Cayce was surprisingly specific about this, and it's worth understanding even though it might challenge some modern medical practices. He said ideally, the body should remain undisturbed for 3 days to allow the energetic disconnection to complete naturally. The silver cord doesn't sever instantly at the moment of death. It dissolves gradually, and that dissolution happens most smoothly when the body is left in peace. When cremation happens within hours of death, or when organs are harvested immediately after death is declared, it can create a jarring shock to the soul that's still loosening from physical form. This doesn't mean these practices are wrong. Organ donation saves lives, and that's a profound gift. Cremation is a valid choice for many families, but understanding the impact allows for conscious mitigation. Before cremation or organ donation, spend time in prayer or meditation, consciously supporting the soul's release. Speak to them. Tell them what's happening. Ask for their forgiveness if you're making choices they might not have wanted. Cayce said souls can feel these communications, and they help enormously in navigating the shock of sudden physical disruption. The key point running through all of this, when the silence is interrupted, the soul doesn't suffer permanent harm. Nothing is lost forever, but the journey becomes more complex. The integration that might have happened smoothly in 3 days might now take weeks, months, even years to complete. And knowing this helps us make more conscious choices about how we grieve, about how we handle bodies, about how we support souls in transition, even when we can't see them anymore. But there's something else Cayce warned about, something more insidious than external interruptions. And that's what we need to talk about next. There's a phenomenon Cayce warned about that he called false silence or shadow sleep. And distinguishing it from the true great silence is crucial for understanding what can go wrong in the death transition. False silence, Cayce said, occurs when a soul is so resistant to seeing the truth of its life that it essentially puts itself into a kind of spiritual coma. Rather than face the life review, rather than feel the dissonance of choices made, rather than encounter its own reflection in the stillness, it retreats into a blank state that resembles sleep but is actually avoidance. These souls aren't resting, they're hiding. Cayce described this as the refusal of the silence's gift, and he said it can persist for what would be years of earth time, the soul suspended in a self-created nowhere that serves no purpose except to delay inevitable awakening. How does this happen? Usually through extreme attachment to false identity, through inability to accept death itself. Souls who remain so, convinced they're still alive that they can't allow the transition to complete, or through deep spiritual bypassing, where the person spent their entire life avoiding truth and continues that avoidance after death. In one particularly sobering reading preserved in the archives, Cayce described a soul who had lived as a religious authority, preaching rigid doctrines about sin and salvation. When this soul died and encountered the actual nature of the afterlife, which bore no resemblance to what he'd taught, the cognitive dissonance was so severe that he essentially shut down. Rather than face the possibility that his entire life's work had been based on misunderstanding, he retreated into false silence, a gray space where nothing happened, nothing changed, nothing challenged the identity he'd built. Cayce said this soul remained there for over 40 years of earth time before guides were finally able to reach him, to gently wake him, to help him face what he'd been avoiding. The warning here isn't meant to create fear, it's meant to create discernment. Because here's how you distinguish true silence from false. The true great silence, even when difficult, always has a quality of movement. Subtle, slow but present. There's a current in it, a gentle forward momentum. You're being carried by something, held by something. Even when you don't know where you're going, there's a sense of going, of process, of transformation unfolding. False silence feels static, stuck, frozen, like being suspended in amber. Nothing moves, nothing changes, and that stasis isn't peace, it's paralysis. For the living, this teaching matters because it emphasizes the importance of facing truth while alive. The more you practice honest self-awareness now, the more you clear your shadow before death, the more you develop the capacity to see yourself clearly without defense, the less likely you are to enter false silence when the time comes. True silence becomes available to those who have already befriended stillness and truth, who have already practiced sitting with uncomfortable revelations about themselves, who have learned that honesty, however painful in the moment, is always more liberating than delusion. It's not earned through perfection. It can't be. Perfection isn't the point. It's earned through willingness. Willingness to see yourself. Willingness to change. Willingness to release what no longer serves, even when that release feels like dying while you're still alive. That willingness is everything, and it's available to you right now in this moment if you're brave enough to practice it. But now let me show you the other side of this teaching, because the silence isn't just about reviewing what was, it's also about healing what remains. One of Cayce's most comforting revelations about the Great Silence is that it functions as profound healing, not just for the soul that enters it, but potentially for the body that was left behind, and even for the living who knew that person. Let me show you how this works, because understanding it might change how you think about death entirely. For the soul itself, Cayce said, the silence heals wounds that couldn't be healed while embodied. Traumas that were too overwhelming to process while alive can finally be metabolized in the stillness. Grief that had no outlet can move through. Rage that had no safe expression can dissolve. Shame that was too heavy to carry can finally be set down. The The body, while you're in it, acts as a kind of filter that protects you from the full intensity of your own consciousness. It mutes things, slows things down, makes them bearable. But that filtering also prevents certain kinds of healing. Some wounds go so deep that they can't be touched while you're still managing the daily requirements of physical existence. The silence, Cayce said, is the universe's mercy, a built-in healing mechanism that ensures no soul carries more than it can transform. In one reading, he described a woman who had lived through unspeakable abuse in childhood. She'd done therapy, spiritual work, all the healing practices available to her. And yet, when she died, there were still wounds so deep they'd shaped her entire existence in ways she'd never been able to fully address. In the great silence, those wounds finally surfaced, not to harm her again, but to complete their journey through her system, to move all the way through and out, leaving her consciousness clear in ways it had never been clear before. When she emerged from the silence, Cayce said, she was transformed, not because she'd forgotten what happened to her, but because it no longer owned her. It had become simply part of her story, no longer the defining center of it. For the body, something mysterious occurs during the 3-day period. Cayce described it as allowing the body to release its memory of the soul, gradually rather than traumatically. This is why bodies often look more peaceful days after death than immediately after. There's a softening that happens, a relaxation, as if the body itself is letting go. Those who prepare bodies for burial will tell you they can feel this. The body that was rigid on day 1 becomes softer by day 3, not just from biological processes, but from something else, something energetic. For the living, Cayce said the silence period creates a kind of healing field that everyone connected to the deceased can draw from, if they're sensitive enough to perceive it. During those 3 days, it's remarkably common to feel the person's presence more strongly than you ever did while they were alive, to receive dream visits, to sense their peace, their love, their completion. This isn't imagination. It's the soul, while in silence, radiating back to those it loves, offering comfort, offering closure, offering healing energy that flows naturally from its own process of integration. And here's a practice Cayce specifically recommended. During the 3 days after someone dies, spend time each day in your own silence. Meditation, prayer, or simply sitting quietly without agenda, and allow yourself to receive whatever healing the deceased soul is offering. You might be surprised by what you feel, what you suddenly understand, what gently releases in you as they release into the silence. The healing works both ways. Their death becomes your initiation. Their crossing becomes your transformation, if you're willing to receive it. Now we go deeper into one of the most profound aspects of Cayce's teaching on the Great Silence. It has the power to complete karma that might otherwise take additional lifetimes to resolve.